They gave her till the first snow to be gone. A girl of 20, with nothing to her name but a father's worn tools and a ruined mill. They said the valley itself would claim her before the year was out. But what they didn't know was that her father had left her more than tools. He'd left her the knowledge of water and stone, and how to make a dead thing live again. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. From the county road that traced the high ridge, Millbrook Hollow looked like a place the world had already forgotten. It was late October of 1888, and the valley was a bowl of tarnished brass and rust, the last of the autumn color, bled out by a succession of hard frosts. The creek, the lifeblood of the hollow, ran low and gray, under a sky the color of slate. At the valley's narrowest point, where the creek tumbled over a series of granite shelves, stood the skeletal remains of the old grist mill. Its stone walls were sound, a testament to the mason who had laid them a century before. But the roof was a ribcage open to the sky, and the great water wheel hung in shattered pieces, tilting into the water like a broken promise. For 10 years it had been a ruin, a landmark of failure that the townsfolk had simply learned not to see. But for the past 3 weeks, a thread of smoke had begun to rise from the chimney of the small miller's cottage attached to the ruin, a sign of life so unexpected it had become the primary subject of town gossip. Nellie Brooks was the source of that smoke. From a distance, she was just a small figure in her father's canvas coat, moving with a deliberateness that seemed at odds with her predicament. She was not frantic. She was not idle. She was working. With a heavy iron pry bar, she levered fallen timbers away from the mill's foundation, stacking them by size and state of decay. She spent hours clearing the mill race, the narrow channel that fed water to the wheel, her shovel scraping against a decade of accumulated silt and stone. She worked from the first thin light of dawn until the purple cold of dusk settled into the valley floor, her movements economical and steady. She was sorting, clearing, and measuring, her mind engaged in a set of calculations no one in Millbrook Hollow could have guessed at. On the last day of October, 2 men rode down the track that led from the town to the mill. The older man, Silas Croft, sat his horse with the rigid posture of someone who owned most of what he surveyed. He was the head of the town council and held the note on nearly every struggling farm in the valley. The younger man was his son, Elias, whose gaze drifted from his father's stiff back to the girl working by the creek, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. They dismounted, and Silas Croft approached Nellie without preamble, a folded document in his hand. "Brooks," he said. It was not a greeting. Nellie stopped her work, leaning the shovel against the stone wall. She did not wipe the smear of mud from her cheek. She simply waited. "Your father, Daniel, died in considerable debt to this town," Croft stated, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. "Taxes unpaid for the last 5 years of his life. The council has reviewed the matter. The deed to this property, the mill and the surrounding 20 acres, has reverted to the township as payment." He held out the paper. It was a formal notice, the ink black and severe against the white page. Nellie looked at the document, but made no move to take it. She knew her father had been ill, that his trade had been rendered obsolete by the big steam mills in the city. But the speed and finality of this felt like a different kind of transaction. "You have until November 15th to vacate the premises," Croft continued, his gaze sweeping over the ruin with unconcealed disdain. "The pass to the east will be open until then. After that, the snows come, and the town cannot be held responsible for your welfare." He was offering her an exit that was also an exile. He was describing her life as over, a problem to be disposed of before winter made it a messy one. He expected tears, or pleading, or perhaps a flash of useless anger. He received none of them. Nellie's eyes, the same clear gray as the creek water, met his. "I'm managing," she said, her voice quiet, but as solid as the foundation stones at her feet. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. She would not take the paper. She would not accept his description of her reality. After a moment of charged silence, Silas Croft placed the notice on a flat-topped boulder, weighting it with a small stone. He turned and mounted his horse, Elias following suit. They rode away, leaving the white paper on the rock, a stark and lonely pronouncement against the gray landscape. Nellie watched them go, then picked up her shovel and went back to work. She had not moved on. The story of Silas Croft's visit to the mill spread through Millbrook Hollow on the cold autumn wind. The consensus formed quickly and settled over the town like the coming frost. The girl was a fool, a stubborn, prideful fool who would rather freeze to death than accept the charity of a train ticket out of the valley. At Gable's General Store, the hub of all town commerce and gossip, Mr. Gable quietly turned a page in his ledger, drawing a thin line through Daniel Brooks's long-standing credit. When Nellie came in for flour and salt pork, he cleared his throat and explained, with an air of regret that did not quite reach his eyes, that he could only accept cash from now on. She had $2 and a handful of change to her name. She bought a bag of cornmeal, a block of salt, and 3 candles, and left the rest of her order on the counter. Outside, women she had known since birth, who had cooed over her as a baby, now found their shoes, or the distant ridgeline, immensely interesting as she passed. They were not cruel by nature, but they were practical. They belonged to the valley, and the valley was a hard place that rewarded pragmatism and punished sentiment. Nellie Brooks had become a ghost before she was even gone. Silas Croft did not need to act further. The town itself, in its collective, quiet withdrawal, was doing his work for him. He had made it known that there was no paid work for Nellie, no mending or cleaning, or farm help to be had. The town was turning its back, a slow, deliberate shunning, designed to make her position untenable. The deadline of November 15th was not just a date on a legal notice. It was the community's shared prediction. She would be gone by then, driven out by hunger and loneliness, long before the first heavy snow. Meanwhile, the season was turning with unusual severity. The signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. The woolly bear caterpillars had been thick all autumn, their black bands wide and their orange stripes narrow, a folk sign for a bitter winter. The squirrels, frantic and bold, had stripped the oak trees bare and were burying acorns high on the slopes, as if anticipating a deep and lasting snowpack. An early, killing frost in late September had blackened the last of the garden crops, leaving the town's root cellars less full than in years past. The old farmer's almanac, which Reverend Miller read from as if it were scripture, predicted a blockade winter, with storms arriving early and staying late, effectively sealing the mountain passes until April. The valley was an isolated place, connected to the wider world by a single, treacherous road. In a bad winter, they were entirely on their own, dependent on the food they had stored and the firewood they had cut. Nellie saw the same signs they did, but she was engaged in a different kind of preparation. While the townspeople looked to their larders, she looked to the water. She spent her days not packing a bag, but wading into the freezing creek, rebuilding the low diversion dam that her father had first constructed 30 years ago. She used river stones, fitting them together like a puzzle, packing the gaps with a mixture of clay and gravel dug from the bank. Her hands were raw, her muscles screaming with a deep, unfamiliar ache, but her focus was absolute. She was not thinking about leaving. She was calculating the physics of her survival. Late one evening, chilled to the bone, she returned to the miller's cottage. By the light of a single candle, she worked a loose stone from the back of the cold fireplace. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a slim leather-bound book. It was her father's journal, filled not with words, but with diagrams. There were detailed schematics of gears and levers, calculations of water pressure and torque, and on the last page, a precise, cross-sectioned drawing of the 2 great millstones, with the words written in his neat hand. The whole art is in the space between. This was the seed of her advantage, the source of a knowledge the town had long forgotten. Her father had been a quiet man, one who spoke most fluently in the language of wood, stone, and iron. Daniel Brooks was a millwright, the last of his kind in the valley, a trade that belonged more to his father's generation than his own. He understood the intricate dance of natural forces, the weight of water, the tensile strength of hickory, the precise friction of granite on granite. in a way that other men understood livestock or scripture. Nellie's education had not happened in a schoolhouse. It had happened in the humming, dust-filled air of the mill. During the last years it was still running. She had been 12, a girl with skinned knees and a mind as absorbent as a dry sponge. She remembered one afternoon, in late summer, the air thick with the sweet smell of corn dust, watching him dress the runner stone. He had hoisted the 2-ton granite wheel with a chain winch, exposing the intricate pattern of furrows, called the lands and grooves, carved into its face. He knelt beside it with his mill bill, a sharp, double-ended steel pick, and began the meticulous work of re-chipping the pattern. He didn't lecture. He just talked as he worked. The rhythmic tink, tink, tink of the steel on the stone, a kind of punctuation. Most folks think the power comes from the water wheel, he'd said, not looking up. And they're not wrong. But the heart of it, Nellie, the heart of it, is right here. He ran a calloused thumb over a freshly sharpened groove. These 2 stones, the bedstone stays put, and this one, the runner, it spins just a hair's breadth above it. It has to float. He paused, looking at her to make sure she understood. It doesn't crush the grain. If it crushes, you get oily paste. It has to shear it. The sharp edge of the furrow on this stone passes over the edge of the furrow on the one below, like 1,000 tiny pairs of scissors, snipping the husk, opening the kernel. He had stood up then, and taken her to the massive wooden gears that transferred power from the water wheel. He showed her the tentering screw, the simple but ingenious device that raised or lowered the runner stone by fractions of an inch. The whole world turns on getting that balance right, he'd told her, his voice low and serious. Too much pressure, you choke the mill. Too little, you just crack the corn. A good miller doesn't use her eyes. She uses her ears. He had cupped a hand to his ear. You listen to the sound of the stones. A high, singing hum. That means they're running true. A low grumble. They're too close. Too much silence. They're too far apart. The stones will tell you what they need. Now, standing in the cold, silent ruin, Nellie held that same mill bill in her hand. The steel was cold, but she could almost feel the phantom warmth of her father's grasp on the wooden handle. She ran her fingers over the pitted surface of the dormant runner stone. For years, she had carried his words as a memory, a piece of her love for him. She had believed he was a master of his craft. But belief and knowledge were not the same thing. To believe was to trust in a memory. To know was to feel the result in your own hands. The town saw a pile of useless rock and rotting wood. She saw a complex machine, a puzzle of applied physics waiting to be solved. She had to learn if her father's knowledge, the one inheritance Silas Croft couldn't seize, now lived in her. The work began not with the mill itself, but with the water that was its life. On the 1st of November, Nellie started the painstaking reconstruction of the water wheel. The original was a ruin of rotted oak and rusted iron bands, but its axle, a massive timber of heartwood pine, was still sound where it entered the mill wall. She spent 2 days salvaging wood from a collapsed hay barn that stood at the far edge of the property, dragging the heavy, weathered planks back to the mill. Her father's drawings were her guide. She laid them out on the floor of the cottage, weighing the corners with stones, studying the precise angles and measurements for the buckets and the shroud, the circular plates that held them. The labor was a brutal education in leverage and patience. Using her father's heavy pry bar, a system of ropes, and a notched log as a fulcrum, she wrestled the timbers into place. Her hands, soft from a year of caring for her ailing father, were soon a mass of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She timed her work by the arc of the low autumn sun, treating her secrecy as a strategic asset. Anyone glancing down from the high road would see only a girl moving wood, an insignificant act of scavenging. Inside the mill, the great gears were a marvel of preservation. Protected from the rain by the remnants of the upper floor, the huge wooden cogs of the great spur wheel were dry and intact. But time had taken its toll. Many of the teeth were worn to nubs. In her father's dusty woodshed, she found a small stack of seasoned hickory, hard as bone, left for this very purpose. For a week, she sat by candlelight, her hands cramping around the handle of a draw knife, carving new cogs. Each one had to be shaped to an exact profile, to mesh perfectly with the lantern gear, the smaller pinion that would turn the runner stone. It was work that required a sculptor's eye and a carpenter's precision. She worked until her vision blurred, her world shrinking to the grain of the wood and the glint of the blade. Finally, she turned to the heart of the mill, the stones. The bedstone was buried under a thick layer of debris and hardened grime. It took her a full day to clean it, revealing the faint pattern of its furrows. The runner stone was the greater challenge. It weighed nearly 2 tons. Using the chain winch that still hung from a massive overhead beam, itself a testament to her father's foresight, she slowly, painstakingly hoisted the stone, centimeter by centimeter. The groan of the winch echoed in the stone chamber, like the sound of a waking giant. With the stone suspended, she could access its face. For 4 days, from dawn to dusk, she knelt on the cold floor, the mill bill in her hand, and began the work of dressing the stone. Tink, tink, tink. The sharp, clear sound of steel on granite filled the silence. She was not just sharpening a tool, she was reawakening a knowledge, carving her father's memory into the rock. She rationed her small bag of cornmeal, her hunger a dull ache that she pushed to the back of her mind. The work was all that mattered. The knowledge had to be proven. November 15th arrived, with a sky full of low, bruised clouds and the taste of snow in the air. It was the day of her eviction, the deadline set by Silas Croft and the town council. They assumed she would be gone, a lone figure walking the road east with a small bundle, defeated by hunger and isolation. But Nellie was not on the road. She was standing at the sluice gate, her hand on the heavy wooden lever. The work was done. The new water wheel was in place, its buckets gleaming with fresh pitch. The mill race was clear and deep, the diversion dam holding a placid pool of creek water. Inside the mill, the newly carved hickory cogs were meshed, the spindle that held the runner stone was greased, and the stones themselves were dressed, their furrows sharp and clean. She had poured the last of her cornmeal, perhaps 3 pounds worth, into the hopper. It was everything she had. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and pulled the lever. The gate lifted. For a moment, there was only the sound of rushing water, a torrent released from its captivity. It surged down the mill race and struck the buckets of the new wheel. There was a deep, groaning creak of wet wood under immense strain, a sound of protest from a machine long dormant. Then, with a shudder that vibrated through the stone walls, the great wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. It found its rhythm. Inside, the sound was deafening. The clatter of the great spur wheel engaging the lantern gear, the rumble of the massive axle turning in its housing. And then, a new sound, lower and more profound. It was the sound her father had told her to listen for. A deep, resonant hum began to build as the massive runner stone, floating on its spindle just a fraction of an inch above the bedstone, began to spin. It was not a grumble of friction, but the clean, singing note of a system in perfect balance. Her heart pounding, Nellie watched the chute at the base of the stone housing. A few seconds passed, an eternity of held breath. Then, a trickle. A pale, fine stream of yellow meal began to pour out, warm to the touch. She caught a handful, rubbing it between her thumb and forefinger. It was not coarse and gritty, nor was it oily and pasted. It was perfect. A fine, soft flour, sheared from the corn by 1,000 invisible scissors. She closed her eyes, the humming of the stones vibrating through the soles of her worn boots. She could almost hear her father's voice, not as a memory, but as a living presence in the chamber. "Listen to the stones, Nellie. They'll tell you what they need." The sound was right. The balance was right. The knowledge was true. At that moment, survival was no longer a question of belief, but a proven fact. The deadline passed. The first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dusting the turning wheel. No one came for her. The first visitor arrived a week later, trudging through 6 inches of fresh snow. It was Reverend Miller, his wife beside him, carrying a basket laden with a loaf of bread. a jar of preserves, and a small slab of bacon. It was an offering of Christian charity, delivered to the stubborn girl they expected to find, huddled by a dying fire, finally broken and ready to accept help. What they found instead baffled them. The path to the cottage was neatly cleared. The great water wheel, which should have been frozen solid, turned steadily, shedding curtains of water that steamed in the frigid air. A low, rhythmic hum emanated from the mill's stone walls. They knocked, and Nellie opened the door, not gaunt and desperate, but with a smudge of grease on her forehead and a quiet energy about her. Her small cottage was warm and smelled of baking cornbread. "Nellie, my child," the Reverend began, his prepared speech about humility and accepting God's providence dying on his lips. "We were concerned." "That's kind of you, Reverend," Nellie said, accepting the basket with a simple nod of thanks. "Please, come in, out of the cold." Inside, they saw the evidence of her work. On a small table sat a sack, nearly full, of pale, finely ground cornmeal. Her father's tools were cleaned and hung in their proper places on the wall. She was not surviving. She was functioning. They asked what she had been doing, and she answered with plain facts. "I repaired the wheel. I dressed the stones. The mill is running." Reverend Miller, a man of words, found himself speechless. He could not reconcile the destitute orphan of town gossip with the competent young woman standing before him. They left the basket, mumbled their goodbyes, and walked back to town in a state of profound confusion. Their report, when it spread, shifted the town's narrative from pity to bewilderment. "She's busy," was all the Reverend could say, and the inadequacy of the word hung in the air. 10 days later, with the snow now a foot deep and the temperature dropping steadily, the next visitors arrived. Silas and Elias Croft appeared on horseback, their breath pluming in the icy air. They had come not out of concern, but for confirmation. Croft had been certain that 2 weeks of deep cold and isolation would have accomplished what his legal notice had not. He expected to find the cottage empty, the door barred, a final admission of defeat. Instead, he saw the same impossible sight that had greeted the Millers: the plume of smoke from the chimney, the cleared path, and the relentless, impossible turning of the water wheel in the half-frozen creek. He dismounted, his face a mask of cold fury. This was not just defiance. It was an invalidation of his authority, an affront to the natural order of things, as he understood them. He strode to the door and hammered on it with his fist. Nellie opened it and stood on the threshold, a silent sentinel. "The deadline has passed," Croft snarled, dispensing with any pretense of civility. "You are trespassing on town property." Nellie's gaze was steady. She did not flinch, nor did she offer any defense. "The mill is running," she repeated, the words as solid and unyielding as the stone walls around her. Croft's eyes swept past her into the warm cottage, then to the humming mill. He saw the full sack of meal. He understood then that she had created her own means of subsistence, a system entirely independent of him and his town. Her survival was no longer contingent on his approval or the town's charity. She had made herself sovereign on this small patch of land. His face hardened, the last vestige of paternalistic concern vanishing, replaced by a raw and undisguised cruelty. "The pass will be closed by the end of the week," he said, his voice low and venomous. "The trappers say it's a blockade winter. No one will get in or out of this valley until spring. Let the winter have you." He turned on his heel and remounted, yanking the reins so hard his horse sidestepped in protest. He rode off without a backward glance. Elias lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Nellie's. In his eyes, she saw not his father's malice, but a dawning, troubled understanding. Then he too turned and followed, a silent accomplice to his father's judgment. The threat was no longer veiled in legal notices or social shunning. It had been spoken aloud, a curse, left to hang in the freezing air. The old trappers and the almanac had been right. 3 days after the Crofts' visit, the sky turned a flat, ominous gray, and a blizzard swept down from the north. For 4 days it raged, a relentless deluge of wind and snow that buried the valley. When it finally ceased, the world was silent and white, transformed. The pass was gone, obliterated under a 20-foot drift. Millbrook Hollow was officially cut off from the world, an island in a sea of snow. The blockade winter had begun. The town, which had felt so secure in its collective wisdom, began to feel the first pinch of its miscalculation. The suffering was not dramatic, but a slow, creeping erosion of security, rendered in a series of quiet, domestic tragedies. At the Gables store, the inventory, which had seemed so plentiful, dwindled with alarming speed. Mr. Gable began rationing sugar and coffee, his forced cheerfulness fooling no one. Old Jedediah Slocum, whose farm bordered the woods, woke one morning to find the roof of his main barn had collapsed under the immense weight of the snow, killing 3 of his best milk cows. He hadn't taken the time to reinforce the main beam in the fall. He'd been too busy helping his son-in-law clear a new field. The Warren family, with their 3 small children, discovered that the barrels of wheat in their cellar had been breached by mice. Worse, what remained was whole kernel wheat, hard as pebbles. With the mill gone, they had no way to grind it into flour. Their children began to cry, from a hunger that bread alone could satisfy. Small, fatal mistakes and unforeseen accidents, amplified by their isolation, began to unravel the fragile fabric of the community. In stark contrast, life at the mill settled into a rhythm of profound and purposeful order. Nellie's system, born of her father's knowledge, performed exactly as it was designed. The turning water wheel, though it moved slower in the thickening ice, provided a constant source of power. She had ingeniously rigged a secondary belt from the main axle to a bucksaw, allowing her to cut firewood from the timbers of the collapsed barn with an efficiency her neighbors, relying on handsaws and axes, could not match. The miller's cottage was always warm. The latent heat from the friction of the grinding stones, channeled through a clever vent her father had built, kept the deep chill from the attached living quarters. Most importantly, she had food. After grinding her own small supply, she had discovered several old grain sacks in a forgotten corner of the mill's storage room, containing over 100 pounds of flint corn, hard and seemingly useless, but perfectly preserved. The stones made short work of it. Her small pantry was stocked with sacks of fresh, sweet meal. While the town began to starve, Nellie ate hot cornbread baked on the hearth. The relentless cold, that probed at the chinking of every other house in the valley, was held at bay by her knowledge. The contrast was the argument. Her applied competence had built a fortress of survival, while the town's collective resources, applied without foresight, were proving to be a paper wall against the siege of winter. One evening, as the temperature plunged to 20 below zero, and the wind howled around the stone corners of the mill, Nellie sat by her fire. She was not lonely. The hum of the stones was her constant companion, a testament to the enduring power of a single, correct idea. The knock came during the worst of the next storm, a frantic pounding barely audible over the shriek of the wind. Nellie unbarred the door to find a figure encrusted in snow, his face raw from the cold. It was John Warren, his eyes wide with a desperation that eclipsed all pride. In his arms, he clutched a burlap sack. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I heard," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Gable said he saw meal, that the mill was running. My children, they haven't had bread in a week. We have wheat, but it's no good to us like this." He held out the sack of hard, frozen kernels, as if it were a last, desperate prayer. Nellie did not just take the sack. She pulled him inside, sat him by the fire, and ladled a steaming bowl of corn porridge for him. While he ate, his shivering slowly subsiding, she brought his wife and 3 children from their cold house, a quarter-mile away, guiding them back with a lantern through the blizzard. She fed them all, the warmth of the food and the cottage, seeming to rekindle a spark in their exhausted eyes. Only then, after the immediate crisis of hunger and cold had been addressed, did she turn to the matter of the mill. She led John Warren into the humming stone chamber. "I'll grind this for you," she said, gesturing to his sack. "But you need to learn how it's done. The knowledge is what matters." She didn't treat him as a supplicant. She treated him as an apprentice. She showed him how to regulate the flow of water at the sluice gate, how to adjust the tentering screw to control the gap between the stones. She made him put his hand on the stone housing to feel the vibration, made him listen to the pitch of the hum. "You have to listen," she said, her father's words now her own. "The stones will tell you what they need." He learned quickly, his farmer's hands surprisingly deft. He left not just with a sack of precious flour, but with the seed of a new understanding. John Warren became her first disciple. He returned to the town and told his story, his testimony, carrying the weight of a man who had seen his children starve and then seen them fed. "She's not just running it," he told a small gathering at the church. "She understands it. She can teach it." The news spread, not as gossip, but as a message of hope. The trickle of visitors began. First, Jedediah Slocum, with a sack of oats he'd salvaged. Then the Gable family, their store shelves now bare, bringing their own private stock of rye. Each person, or family, who made the pilgrimage to the mill was first fed, then taught. Nellie refused to be a mere charity station. She insisted they participate, that they understand the principles of the machine that was saving them. The mill, once the symbol of her ostracization, had become the beating, grinding heart of the Hollow's survival. Nellie, the girl they had written off, was now the quiet, unassuming center of their world. The winter tightened its grip, a long, grinding siege. By late February, the Hollow was a study in desperation. The collective larders were empty. The town was living hand-to-mouth on what the mill could produce, with families pooling the last of their stored grain. One afternoon, a wagon appeared, drawn by a single, exhausted horse, carving deep ruts in the packed snow of the mill road. It was Elias Croft. He handled the reins, his face gaunt and etched with a weariness that went beyond the physical. In the back of the wagon, bundled in blankets, lay his father. Silas Croft was pale and still, his breathing shallow, weakened by a fever that had taken hold in a body already depleted by hunger. Their own stores, which had been the most plentiful in the valley, had finally run out. Pride had kept them away for weeks, but the fever had broken it. Elias did not speak. He simply stopped the horse and looked at Nellie, who had come out to see who was approaching. His eyes, clear and direct, held no demand, only a vast, humbled surrender. It was the most eloquent plea she had ever heard. Without a word, Nellie helped him carry his father inside and lay him on her own cot by the fire. She brewed a thin broth from dried herbs and the last of a salted ham hock, and spooned it carefully between the old man's cracked lips. She treated him with the same impartial, methodical care she had shown the Warren family. There was no triumph in her actions, no hint of vengeance. There was only the quiet, profound work of keeping a life from flickering out. Later, she led Elias into the mill. She pointed to the sacks of barley they had brought. "The hopper is low," she said simply, and she began to teach him, just as she had taught John Warren and all the others. She showed him the gears, the lever, the screw. She made him listen to the stones. The equality of her treatment was the only verdict necessary. By offering her knowledge and her warmth to the man who had wished for the winter to have her, she delivered a judgment more complete than any speech or accusation could achieve. Silas Croft slowly recovered his strength in the miller's cottage, a silent witness to the functioning world his adversary had built. A week later, a warm wind, a chinook, blew down from the mountains. The great thaw began. The blockade winter was finally breaking. As the snow receded and the creek swelled with meltwater, the town of Millbrook Hollow began to take stock. The stories that had been shared in huddled whispers around cold hearths now became public testimony. At the first town meeting, held in the still chilly church, John Warren stood up and spoke of how Nellie had saved his children. Reverend Miller confessed his own short-sightedness and praised her generosity and wisdom. One by one, nearly a dozen heads of families stood to tell the same story. They had gone to the mill in desperation and had been met with warmth, food, and knowledge. Silas Croft sat in the back pew, diminished and silent, his recovery still fragile. He did not speak. He did not have to. His presence was its own form of testimony. When the motion was put forward by Jedediah Slocum to formally deed the mill and the surrounding 20 acres to Nellie Brooks, free and clear, and to issue a formal, written apology for the town's actions, the vote was unanimous. There was no courtroom drama, no legal battle. The dispossession had been reversed by the simple, undeniable weight of earned respect. Nellie, who had not asked for the meeting or attended it, was brought the new deed that evening by a small delegation led by Elias Croft. She accepted it with a quiet nod, as if accepting a fact that had already been proven true by the turning of the stones. Time, which had seemed to stand still during the blockade winter, began to flow again, accelerating into years, then decades. Nellie Brooks ran the mill for the next 50 years. It became the reliable, beating heart of the Valley's economy. She never modernized it. She believed in the simple elegance of water and stone. Over the years, she made improvements, adding a second set of smaller, finer stones for wheat flour and a system of belts to power a small lumber saw. The winter of '88 passed into local legend, a story told to children to teach them about foolish pride and true competence. Nellie never married. There were suitors, drawn to her quiet strength and the prosperity of the mill. But she declined them all, with a gentle firmness. Her life's work was the mill itself, its rhythms, and demands a more constant companion than any man. She became the Valley's teacher. She taught the millwright's trade to a handful of young men, including Elias Croft, who grew into a thoughtful man and became her lifelong friend, managing the business side of the mill's operations. In the late 1890s, a journalist from a city newspaper, chasing a story about resilient frontier communities, heard of her. He came and wrote a long, admiring article, calling her the Queen of the Hollow, a title that made her laugh. The article brought a letter from a manufacturing firm in the East, offering to buy the rights to her mill's design improvements. She wrote back a short, polite letter of refusal. "The knowledge belongs to anyone who wants it," she told Elias. The figures of that long-ago winter moved through their lives. The Warren children grew up and had children of their own, and every autumn, they brought Nellie the first and best sack of grain from their harvest. Silas Croft lived another 10 years, a quiet and withdrawn man, forever defined not by the wealth he had accumulated, but by the winter he was saved by the girl he had tried to destroy. Nellie outlived them all. She died peacefully in her sleep one spring morning, in 1938, in the small cottage attached to the mill, at the age of 70. The entire valley, a place now prosperous and connected to the world, mourned her passing. The mill was left to the grandson of John Warren, a young man who had learned the trade at Nellie's side. Decades passed. The world changed. The small grist mill could no longer compete with the great industrial factories, and it fell into disuse once more. In the late 1970s, a young architectural historian, researching early American industrial structures, found his way to Millbrook Hollow. He had read about the mill in a dusty county archive. He found it silent, but not derelict, maintained by the town as a historic landmark. Intrigued by the unique design of the water gate, he found the old lever, moss-covered but solid. With some effort, he pulled it open. The sluice gate lifted. Water, clear and cold, rushed down the stone channel. It hit the buckets of the great wheel, and with a familiar, deep-throated groan, the wheel began to turn. Inside the stone building, gears engaged, the axle rumbled, and the great runner stone began to spin, rising a fraction of an inch to float just above the bedstone. A low, singing hum filled the air, a sound of perfect balance, a wordless confirmation of a life's work, a legacy of knowledge that outlasted its keeper.